Silver Forbidden, the truth about 2026 critical mineral laws. The word is already spreading across trading desks, across financial channels, across the conversations of people who thought they were protected. Silver is being restricted. But here is what no one is telling you. The real story is not about a ban. It is about something far larger, far more calculated, and far more consequential for every businessman, every entrepreneur, every person who holds this metal and believes it is safe. The 2026 laws are already written. The clock is already running. And what happens in the next few months will separate those who understood this moment from those who simply watched it pass. Welcome to Financial Crisis Explained, the channel where we do not guess, we do not panic, we simply follow the facts wherever they lead. Now, before we go any further, if you have found this channel for the first time today, think of subscribing the same way you would think of renewing an old insurance policy. You do not wait until the storm arrives. You sign before the rain begins. Hit that subscribe button because the information on this channel is the kind your younger self would have paid good money for. And one more thing, we always love to know who is in the room with us today. Drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching this from? Whether you are watching from Karachi, London, Dubai, New York, or somewhere quietly in between, let us know. We read every single one. Now let us get into what is really happening with silver and why 2026 may be the year everything changes. There is a particular kind of moment in financial history that does not announce itself loudly. It does not come with sirens. It does not come with emergency broadcasts. It comes quietly, buried inside a government document that most people will never read, attached to a policy framework that most analysts will never fully explain, and carrying consequences that most investors will not understand until it is far too late to adjust. That moment arrived in November of 2025, and almost no one in the retail investment world noticed it for what it actually was. The United States Geological Survey, operating under the direct mandate of the Energy Act of 2020, published an updated assessment of critical minerals essential to national security, industrial production, and economic stability. This was not a dramatic announcement. There were no press conferences. There were no breaking news alerts. It was a policy document, the kind that moves through Washington the way all consequential documents move, slowly, deliberately, and far beneath the noise level of financial media. But inside that document, silver had been repositioned. Not removed, not banned, not confiscated, repositioned. And that single word carries more weight than almost anything else that has been said about silver in the past 12 months. To understand why that repositioning matters, you must first understand what a critical mineral designation actually means inside the machinery of modern government. When a government classifies a mineral as critical, it is not making a statement about price. It is not making a statement about scarcity in the traditional sense. It is making a strategic declaration. It is saying that this material is so essential to the functioning of our economy, our defense systems, and our industrial capacity that its supply chain can no longer be left entirely to the open market. That is a profound shift in thinking. And it has profound consequences for every businessman, every entrepreneur, and every investor who touches this metal, whether they realize it or not. The Energy Act of 2020 set the legal foundation. The 2025 USGS assessment built the framework on top of that foundation, and the 2026 critical mineral laws that are now moving through regulatory channels are the structure being raised on that framework. This is not speculation, this is sequencing, and understanding the sequence is everything. When governments begin classifying materials as critical, history shows a very consistent pattern of what follows. Export controls tighten. Domestic stockpiling begins. Industrial buyers receive preferential access frameworks. And the open market, the market that retail investors and small businesses have always relied upon, begins to experience friction that it has never experienced before. That friction does not feel dramatic at first. It feels like paperwork. It feels like new compliance requirements. It feels like slightly longer procurement timelines. And then one morning, it feels like a shortage. This is precisely what happened with rare earth elements in the years following China's export restrictions of 2010. It is what happened with semiconductor materials during the supply chain crisis of 2021. And it is what is beginning to happen now with silver in a policy environment that most people are either misreading entirely or not reading at all. The internet, to its considerable discredit, took this policy signal and converted it into something far simpler and far more emotionally satisfying. Silver is being banned. The government is coming for your metal. The confiscation is imminent. These narratives spread because fear spreads faster than analysis. They spread because the human mind, particularly the mind of someone who has invested real money into a physical asset as protection against financial instability, is acutely vulnerable to the suggestion that their protection is being removed. But here is the critical distinction that every serious decision maker must hold clearly. There is an enormous difference between a government banning silver and a government deciding that silver is too strategically important to leave unmanaged. One is a threat to your holdings. The other, if you understand it correctly, is something else entirely. It is a signal. And in the next part, we will show you exactly what that signal is pointing toward and why the industrial world's relationship with silver is about to change in ways that most retail investors have not even begun to calculate. Most people who own silver have never once visited a solar panel manufacturing facility. They have never walked through a semiconductor fabrication plant. They have never stood inside a defense contractor's production floor and watched precision-guided munitions move down an assembly line. And because they have never seen these places, they think about silver the way most of the world thinks about silver: as a coin, as a bar, as jewelry, as a relic of older monetary systems sitting quietly in a safe or a drawer somewhere waiting for the financial system to collapse so that it can finally have its moment. That mental image is not just incomplete, it is dangerously outdated. And the gap between that image and the physical reality of what silver actually does in the modern industrial world is precisely the gap that is driving every major policy decision being made about this metal right now. Here is the reality that governments already know and that most retail investors have not yet fully absorbed. Silver is not primarily a monetary metal anymore. It has not been for decades. Today, silver is an industrial metal of the highest strategic order, and its presence inside the technologies that define modern economic and military power is so deep, so structural, and so technically irreplaceable that no government with serious industrial ambitions can afford to treat its supply chain casually. Consider the numbers with the seriousness they deserve. The solar energy industry alone now consumes approximately 20% of total global silver supply annually. Every single photovoltaic cell, the fundamental unit of every solar panel produced anywhere in the world, requires silver paste to conduct electricity. There is no commercially viable substitute for this application at scale. Engineers have been searching for one for 15 years. They have not found it. And as governments across the United States, Europe, and Asia accelerate their renewable energy mandates into 2026 and beyond, that 20% figure is not holding steady. It is climbing. Now move beyond solar into the world of semiconductors, and the picture becomes even more consequential. Silver is a core material in the bonding wires, conductive coatings, and thermal management systems that sit inside virtually every advanced chip produced today. As artificial intelligence infrastructure expands at a rate that is straining every supply chain it touches, the demand for the physical materials that make AI hardware possible is expanding with it. Silver is among those materials. It is not a peripheral input, it is a foundational one. And then there is defense. This is the part of the silver story that financial media rarely discusses with the depth it deserves, because defense procurement is not a topic that generates the same emotional engagement as price charts and confiscation theories. But it is arguably the most important part of the story for understanding why the 2026 regulatory environment looks the way it does. Modern precision-guided munitions, radar systems, electronic warfare equipment, and communication satellites all rely on silver-based components. When the United States Department of Defense began pushing for expanded critical mineral protections in its recent budget frameworks, silver was not an afterthought in those conversations. It was a central concern. This is the industrial machine that runs on silver. It is not a machine that can be paused while policymakers debate. It is not a machine that can substitute its way out of a supply disruption with 6 months of engineering work. It is a machine that requires a continuous, reliable, and increasingly large flow of this metal to keep functioning. And that machine is now in direct competition with the retail investor, the small business owner, and the individual entrepreneur for access to the same finite supply. When governments look at that competition and begin designing regulatory frameworks around critical mineral access, they are not designing those frameworks with the individual silver holder in mind. They are designing them around industrial continuity, military readiness, and technological supremacy. That is not a cynical observation. That is simply how strategic resource policy has always worked throughout history, and understanding that logic is the first step toward navigating it intelligently. Because the question that every serious entrepreneur and businessman must now be asking is not whether silver is being banned. That question is a distraction. The real question is far more important, far more actionable, and far more consequential for anyone who wants to position themselves correctly before the 2026 regulatory window fully closes. That question is what Part 3 will answer directly. There is a test that separates serious investors from emotional ones. It is not a complicated test. It does not require an advanced degree in economics or a background in commodity trading. It requires only one thing: the ability to sit down with the actual text of a policy document, read it carefully, and resist the powerful temptation to replace what it says with what you feared it might say before you opened it. Most people fail this test, not because they are unintelligent, but because by the time a policy document reaches them, it has already passed through 12 layers of interpretation, each one adding a little more alarm, a little more urgency, and a little less precision than the layer before it. What begins as a regulatory framework in a government office ends as a confiscation warning on a financial YouTube channel. And somewhere in that journey, the truth gets quietly left behind. This is exactly what has happened with the 2026 critical mineral laws. And the cost of that distortion for anyone making real financial decisions based on distorted information is not abstract. It is measurable. It shows up in poor timing, wrong positioning, and missed opportunities that do not announce themselves until long after they have passed. So let us do what most channels will not do. Let us read the policy carefully and talk about what it actually says. The 2026 Critical Mineral Regulatory Framework, built on the foundation of the Energy Act of 2020 and the subsequent USGS critical mineral assessments, does several things with considerable precision. It establishes priority access frameworks for domestic industrial consumers of designated critical minerals. It creates new reporting requirements for entities that import, export, or hold significant quantities of these minerals in commercial quantities. It empowers federal agencies to intervene in supply chains during declared national resource emergencies, and it allocates significant funding toward domestic mining, refining, and stockpiling operations for minerals deemed essential to national security. What it does not do is equally important to state clearly. It does not prohibit private ownership of silver. It does not authorize the seizure of individually held silver assets. It does not establish price controls on retail silver transactions. And it does not create any legal mechanism by which an ordinary citizen, investor, or small business owner is prevented from buying, selling, or holding silver in the forms they currently hold it. The ban narrative is not supported by the text of the law. It is not supported by the regulatory history leading up to the law. And it is not supported by any credible legal analysis of what these frameworks actually empower governments to do. But here is where the analysis must become more sophisticated, because dismissing the panic entirely would be its own form of intellectual failure. The fact that a ban is not happening does not mean that nothing consequential is happening. It means that something different is happening, something that requires a more nuanced and ultimately more useful framework to understand. What the 2026 laws are creating is not a prohibition. They are creating a tiered access environment. In a tiered access environment, the metal does not disappear. It does not get confiscated. It does not vanish from the market overnight. What happens instead is more subtle and in many ways more challenging to navigate. Certain categories of buyers gain structural advantages in accessing supply. Certain categories of transactions attract new layers of regulatory friction, and the open, frictionless market that existed before the classification begins to develop fault lines that separate those who understood the new rules from those who did not. This distinction matters enormously for the business community because the entrepreneur or investor who spent the last 6 months preparing for a confiscation that was never coming has been preparing for the wrong scenario entirely. They have been building a bunker against a storm that is not arriving, while the actual weather event, a fundamental restructuring of silver market access, has been quietly developing right outside their window. The historical precedent for this pattern is both clear and instructive. When the United States government designated rare earth elements as critical minerals in the years following 2010, private ownership of rare earth materials was never banned. What changed was access. What changed was pricing. What changed was the competitive landscape for businesses that depended on those materials. The companies that read the policy correctly repositioned their supply chains, secured long-term contracts, and built strategic reserves before the friction arrived. The companies that either panicked into the wrong response or ignored the signal entirely found themselves paying premium prices in a constrained market while their better prepared competitors moved ahead of them. Silver in 2026 is not identical to rare earths in 2010, but the policy logic is remarkably similar. And the gap between those who understand that logic and those who are still debating whether the government is coming to take their coins is a gap that will have real financial consequences in the months ahead. Closing that gap is not a matter of ideology. It is not a matter of being bullish or bearish on silver as an asset. It is a matter of reading the room correctly at a moment when the room is changing faster than most people realize. And in part 4, we will show you precisely how the serious decision makers are reading it, what they are doing with that reading, and why the next 18 months represent a window that, once closed, will not reopen on the same terms again. There is a concept in military strategy called the action window. It refers to the brief period of time between the moment intelligence becomes available and the moment that intelligence becomes irrelevant, because the situation has already moved past the point where acting on it would make any difference. Professional strategists treat action windows with an almost obsessive seriousness. They understand that information without timely action is not an asset. It is simply a record of an opportunity that was recognized too late to use. The silver market in 2026 has an action window. It is open right now, and the evidence suggests quite strongly that it will not remain open much longer. What separates the businessmen and entrepreneurs who will look back on this moment with satisfaction from those who will look back on it with regret is not intelligence. It is not access to secret information. It is not connections to powerful insiders. It is something far more democratic and far more demanding. It is the willingness to act on analysis before the crowd catches up and before the regulatory environment fully hardens into its new shape. So what are the serious decision makers actually doing right now? Not the speculators, not the panic buyers who flooded coin dealers after the first confiscation headline appeared, not the ideologically motivated holders who treat silver as a political statement rather than a strategic asset. The serious decision makers, the ones whose decisions are driven by policy reading, supply chain analysis, and long-term positioning, rather than by fear or ideology. They are doing several things simultaneously, and each of those things reflects a sophisticated understanding of what the 2026 critical mineral framework actually creates, as opposed to what the internet claims it creates. The first thing they are doing is securing supply chain positions before the tiered access environment fully crystallizes. Industrial businesses that depend on silver as an input material are not waiting for the regulatory friction to arrive before addressing it. They are signing longer-term supply agreements now, while the open market still functions with relative freedom, and while the pricing has not yet fully reflected the coming constraints. This is not hoarding. This is basic procurement intelligence applied to a changing regulatory landscape. The businesses that lock in supply relationships now will have structural cost advantages over competitors who wait until the new framework is fully operational. The second thing serious decision makers are doing is repositioning their understanding of silver from a single asset category into two distinct categories that the 2026 environment will treat very differently. The first category is monetary silver, the coins, the bars, the individually held physical assets that exist primarily as a store of value or a hedge against currency instability. The second category is industrial silver, the material that flows through manufacturing supply chains, technology production, and defense procurement. These two categories of the same metal are about to experience very different regulatory and market environments. Understanding which category your silver exposure belongs to and what the 2026 framework means specifically for that category is no longer optional analysis for serious investors. It is foundational. The third thing they are doing is watching the geographic dimension of this story with a level of attention that most retail commentary completely ignores. The United States is not the only government building a critical mineral framework around silver right now. The European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act, which entered its implementation phase in 2024, contains silver provisions that are moving in a parallel direction. China, which controls significant portions of global silver refining capacity, has been quietly tightening its own export frameworks for strategic minerals. What is emerging is not a single national policy story. It is a multilateral strategic competition for critical mineral supply chains, and silver sits inside that competition in a position of growing importance. For the young entrepreneur watching this and trying to understand what any of this means for the decisions they need to make right now, the translation is both straightforward and urgent. The businesses that will thrive in the post-2026 silver environment are not necessarily the ones with the most silver. They are the ones with the clearest understanding of how the new access frameworks operate and the most intelligent positioning relative to those frameworks. That might mean securing supply relationships. It might mean adjusting product designs to optimize silver usage efficiency before input costs rise. It might mean building financial exposure to the companies that sit at the most advantageous points in the silver supply chain as the critical mineral framework reshapes market dynamics. What it does not mean is waiting. The action window in military strategy closes not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet shift in conditions that makes the previous opportunity simply unavailable at the previous terms. The 2026 critical mineral laws are not a ban. They are not a confiscation. They are a restructuring. And restructurings throughout the entire history of commodity markets and industrial policy have always created a class of winners who read the change correctly and a class of losers who either panicked into the wrong response or waited until the new reality had already priced them out. The window is open. The analysis is available. The policy text is public. The historical precedents are clear. Everything required to make an intelligent decision about silver in this environment already exists and is already accessible to anyone willing to approach this moment with the seriousness it deserves. The only question that remains, and it is the question that every person watching this must answer for themselves, is whether they will use this window or simply watch it close. Because in financial history, the most expensive thing a serious decision maker can ever say is not that they did not see it coming. The most expensive thing they can ever say is that they saw it, they understood it, and they waited just a little too long to act.